The wind hit the windows so hard that night I remember the front door rattling like someone was trying to get in. I had just come back from checking the boiler room when I saw the vacancy sign flicker out. 1 second it was glowing red in the snow, the next it just went dark. Then the backup lights kicked in, and I realized the whole back wing had lost power. A single set of boot prints stretched from the front porch down toward the end of the cabins. I followed them until they stopped right outside room 6, the room I hadn't assigned to anyone. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever worked a job that just felt different after dark. And if these stories help pass the time, I'd love to have you join me for the next one. My name's Dana Ellis. I was 37 when this happened. I just started a winter job running the front desk at a mountain lodge in Colorado about 2 hours west of Denver. Not a ski resort exactly. More of a quiet place where older couples or solo hikers would stay a night or two before heading further up into the Rockies. The kind of place with just enough business to stay open year-round, but not enough to ever feel busy. I'd taken the job mostly for the isolation. After my divorce, I wasn't looking to be around many people. This was the winter of 2006. We had snow from October through April that year, and I remember the days blending into each other, the silence of fresh snow, the creak of floorboards, the smell of melting pine sap near the fireplace. Nights were especially quiet. After 9 p.m., there was rarely a phone call or a knock. Just me and Len Turner, the maintenance guy, taking turns, doing rounds, or watching the little black and white security monitor behind the desk. It was mid-January when the quiet man checked in. That's what I came to call him. He never gave a name, and I didn't ask for one. Sometimes with guests like that, you just follow their lead. He showed up around 10:30 p.m., just as the snow started coming down hard. I'd been about to lock the office for the night when I saw headlights creeping up the long driveway. A gray sedan, Idaho plates. The man who stepped out was maybe early 60s tall, a little stooped with this long green canvas coat that hung past his knees. No suitcase, no bag, just a folded newspaper tucked under one arm and a gloved hand holding cash exact amount for one night. He didn't speak when I asked for a name for the ledger, just pointed to room 6 on the map behind me. We usually didn't let guests choose their rooms after dark, but something about him made me nod without thinking. He took the key, an old brass one on a leather tag, and walked back out into the snow without another word. Len was out in the workshop when the man arrived, but I told him about it later over coffee. Didn't say a thing he asked. I shook my head. Not even a nod. I said no, just pointed to room 6 like he already knew the place. That night I slept in the manager's unit behind the front desk like I always did. Around 3:00 a.m., I woke up to the power flickering in the back half of the lodge. Len radioed in to say he was checking the junction box near the cabins, and I offered to meet him outside to help check doors. The wind was bitter that night, loud enough to drown out your own boots in the snow. I did a quick head count by peering into the office ledger. We only had 4 occupied rooms. 5 now, with the quiet man in room 6. I decided to walk down and make sure his heat was working. I tapped on the door, not loud, just enough to be heard if he was awake. No answer, but I could see the thin strip of yellow under the door. The lights were on inside. I didn't want to disturb him again, so I moved on. Next morning, I noticed something odd. The sedan was still parked where he left it, engine cold, windshield buried. But room 6's key was back on the counter, just sitting there neat as anything, like he'd returned it before sunrise. The bed was made trash, empty towels unused, not in a housekeeping's been through way, in a no one touched a thing way. But I know I gave him that key. I wrote it down. I even marked it paid in cash. The register had no record of a return, and I never saw the front door open during my overnight shift. That afternoon, Len and I checked the security tape. The camera that faced the cabin walkway had been offline most of the night, just static. The others were working fine. We could see me walking back from the main lodge. We could see Len in the utility room, but no trace of the man arriving or leaving. I called the county sheriff just to file a report, not that there was a crime, but something about it didn't sit right. They ran the plate from the car. It wasn't stolen. Belonged to a man named George Brannan. Lived in Pocatello. Died in 1999. I didn't sleep well for a while after that. Room 6 stayed empty the rest of the season. Every now and then I'd find the door slightly ajar even after locking it. And once, just once, I swear I saw the bedside lamp glowing from halfway across the yard. I walked over, opened the door. The light clicked off on its own. I don't tell this story often. People always jump to conclusions. But if you've ever worked a place that gets real quiet after midnight, you know. Some rooms remember things. Some guests don't sign in. And every so often a man shows up just before closing, pays in cash, leaves no name, and you never see him again. Only the key, right where you left it, cold to the touch. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those memories that makes people look at you differently, like you've been carrying around something that should have been buried, not remembered. Back in 2019, I was working nights at a wholesale distribution warehouse outside Allentown. I managed the overnight shift, mostly coordinating incoming loads, running inventory reports, making sure the floor crew stayed on task. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I liked the solitude. The building was huge, 4 loading bays, 2 mezzanines and aisles tall enough to lose someone in. After 10 p.m., it got quiet in a way that didn't bother me. Fluorescent hum, soft clatter from forklifts, and the occasional buzz of the freight elevator. That was the rhythm of those nights. Until the week we brought Wesley on. He was a temp, started on a Tuesday, mid-20s maybe, wiry frame, shaggy, dark hair that looked like it hadn't seen a brush in weeks. Came in with all the right paperwork and nodded through orientation, but barely said 2 words. You get a lot of guys like that in warehouses, quiet just there for the paycheck. I didn't think much of it. He worked slower than most, but not enough to raise a flag. By Thursday, though, the crew started mentioning small things. Someone had found a pallet halfway broken down with all the contents neatly restacked off to the side, something no one remembered doing. One of the overnight techs, Phil, swore the break room fridge had been unplugged for no reason. That kind of petty stuff happens from time to time. Tired hands, weird pranks. But the timing made me take note. Friday night, Wesley clocked in early. Real early. I found out later he'd swiped his badge around 6:12 p.m., a full 3 hours before shift start. Security hadn't caught it, probably assumed it was someone from second shift staying over. When I came in at 9, he was already on the floor reorganizing stock, like it was part of the plan. Said he just felt like getting ahead. I reminded him we weren't paying for extra hours and to stick to his shift window. He nodded, but didn't look at me. That was the first time I noticed he always kept his head turned just slightly away, not fully just enough that you never quite met his eyes. The night ran long. A truck scheduled for midnight didn't show until nearly 2. That meant the team stayed late, and most were gone by 3:30. I walked the floor around 3:45, did a final check of the inventory logs, shut down the forklifts, and turned off the mezzanine lights. I thought everyone had cleared out, but as I passed by aisle 12, the overflow section near the old HVAC units, I caught movement in my peripheral. At first, I thought it was just my reflection in the plexiglass storage windows, but then I saw someone standing near the bottom of the shelving facing the wall. I called out thinking it might be Phil or one of the guys grabbing tools. No response. I stepped in closer and realized it was Wesley still in uniform. Motionless hands at his sides, staring at the bare wall like it had something written on it. I asked if he needed help or had forgotten to clock out. He didn't turn around, just stood there like he was waiting for something. I didn't get closer. Something about the posture, the stillness, it didn't sit right. I said his name again firmer. He finally turned slow and deliberate and gave this faint smile. Not a creepy one, just off, like it wasn't meant for me. He said, "Almost done," and then walked away, heading toward the back hallway that leads to the loading dock. I followed at a distance, planning to catch him at the time clock, but when I rounded the corner, he was gone. Just gone. No exit alarm had sounded and the doors were locked. I did a sweep, checked the restroom, the dock, even the exterior gate camera. Nothing. I chalked it up to fatigue and wrote myself a note to bring it up with HR on Monday. But when I reviewed the badge logs for the night, there was no record of Wesley ever clocking in or out. I called the temp agency that next morning. The woman on the line put me on hold for a while, then came back confused. Said they had no one by that name assigned to our site. I told her I had onboarding documents, but when I opened the digital files, they were blank, just headers. No name, no signature. The only paper record we had was a sign-in sheet from Tuesday, and all that line showed was a partial signature, just a W and a long scribble. By Sunday night, I started feeling uneasy in the building. It was subtle at first. The backup monitor in the break room showed flickers on cameras that weren't connected. Motion detectors on mezzanine 2 would chirp softly, even when no one was scheduled to be up there. And in the hours before dawn, I'd sometimes hear footsteps on the catwalk above the receiving bay, deliberate steps, one at a time, pacing the same section back and forth. I brought it up to Len, our head of building operations. He shrugged and said the motion sensors were finicky, especially in winter. Something about temperature variance, throwing the system off. But that didn't explain the boots I saw on Wednesday size 11s, black rubber soles, wet prints, leading from the dock toward aisle 12. Only one set, no vehicle in or out that night. I was the only one scheduled. I finally called the police after catching a silhouette on camera. The timestamp said 2:47 a.m. The image wasn't sharp, but you could clearly see someone walking between racks. The figure paused, turned, then faded out of frame, not walked out, just faded. I showed the footage to Officer Brewster, the patrol guy who came out that night. He didn't laugh, but I could tell he wanted to. He asked if I'd recently had any stress-related episodes or was on any medication. I told him to review the building access logs himself. When he did, his expression changed. He noticed that the log had repeated entries at strange intervals, same badge number swiping in between 2:40 and 2:48 a.m., but never out. The number wasn't even supposed to be active. He printed the data and said he'd file an internal report, but that unless someone was physically harmed, there wasn't much to investigate. 2 weeks later, I transferred to another location. I'd started leaving notes for myself at the front desk each night, just in case I needed to confirm where I'd been, who I'd talked to. The last note I wrote was on a Wednesday. I left it on my desk under a stapler. When I came in Thursday night, the stapler was still there, but the note was gone. In its place was a scrap of warehouse printout paper. On it in shaky black ink were the words, "Almost done." No name, just those 2 words. I don't work nights anymore. I don't even walk down aisle 12 when I visit that branch. And I've stopped asking where they found the badge or why the logs kept showing up long after I left. Some things don't need resolution. They just need to be left alone. The last real job I ever had was driving nights for a cab company that barely kept its license. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady enough, and after 30 years of drifting between factory work and short-term gigs, I didn't mind the routine. Kansas City gets cold after midnight, especially in February, and those warehouse zones east of Maine go dark early. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful, more like something waiting under the pavement. I picked up fares mostly between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., back when there were still a few people who preferred taxis over apps. I remember this one night in particular because the radio had been dead silent for almost 2 hours. That's rare on the overnight circuit. Usually dispatch calls in at least once to check location, or you'll hear another driver griping about a no-show. But that night, nothing. Just the static hiss of an old radio with nobody on the other end around 2:15 a.m. I was sitting outside a closed-up laundromat, sipping from a half-empty thermos, when I got a ping for a pickup near an abandoned warehouse off 35th and Union. The address didn't make sense. That part of the city had been half condemned since the early 2000s. Nobody lived there and nothing legitimate operated that late. But I was the closest car, and the company charged no shows either way, so I accepted it and rolled out slow. The warehouse came into view like a shape behind a fogged-up window. Massive, empty, with sheet metal siding that clicked and flexed in the wind. One single street light stood at the far end of the lot, casting a yellow cone that barely reached the edge of the curb. As I pulled up, I didn't see anyone. I was about to cancel the ride when a man stepped forward from the shadows by the fence line. He was wearing a black jacket zipped up to the collar with one gloved hand raised halfway, not waving, more like acknowledging I was there. He moved steadily toward the car and opened the back passenger door without hesitation. No hesitation, no small talk. He just slid in and said, "Just drive." His voice was calm, but too quiet, like someone who wasn't used to being overheard. I asked him where to, and he said, "Nowhere in particular. Just keep going." Something about the way he said it made my mouth go dry. But I've had plenty of fares who didn't want conversation, folks leaving fights, folks hiding from something, folks thinking too hard. I pulled out of the lot and started heading west along the service road. We drove in silence for a while. I kept glancing at the mirror. He didn't fidget, didn't check his phone, didn't even shift his weight. Just sat there, staring straight ahead at the back of my headrest. No smell of alcohol, no visible injuries. He wasn't twitchy like a drug user, but there was something still about him that I didn't like. Still, I kept driving. About 10 minutes in, I asked again if there was a direction he preferred. He said, "As long as we're moving, it's fine." At this point, I'd made it to the fringe of the industrial park, passing through neighborhoods with blinking street lights and half-boarded shops. The meter clicked over to $8. I thought about ending the ride and telling him I needed a real destination, but before I could, he said something else. "You drive this route often," I said. "Yeah, pretty often." He nodded slowly. "Do you ever notice how quiet it gets around here? Even the power lines go silent." It was true. In that stretch of town, you didn't hear much of anything. No dogs, no music from open windows, just the tires against cracked pavement and the low hum of the dashboard fan. But the way he said it felt more like a test. I was debating whether to head toward the highway and fake an engine issue when he spoke again. "I used to come here when it was busy. This block had 5 different businesses. You could hear people laughing through the alley gates. His tone was flat, like he was repeating something he'd memorized. I asked if he'd worked nearby. He didn't answer right away. Then he leaned slightly forward and said, "Not exactly worked, just waited. There's a difference." That was when I decided to pull into a gas station and end the ride. It was a place I'd stopped before, well lit and open all night. I figured I could claim I needed to refuel and let him out there. I rolled to a stop near Pump 3 and told him the ride was on me, but I'd need to shut down here for a bit. He didn't move. I turned halfway in my seat and said, "Hey, this is a good spot to stretch your legs." He looked at the gas station through the window, then back at me. His voice was quieter now. "They won't see me. You could go in and describe me, but they won't know who you mean." That's when I felt it. Not fear exactly, more like a slow pressure building in my chest. I stepped out of the cab and walked into the store, trying to keep my breathing steady. The clerk was a younger guy, maybe mid-20s, flipping through a magazine behind the counter. I asked if he could call someone to check out a fare, acting strange. He looked over my shoulder toward the car. "What fare?" I turned. The back seat was empty. I stepped back outside and opened the rear door myself. Nothing. Just the faint indent of where someone might have sat and a bit of condensation on the glass. I stood there longer than I care to admit, trying to remember if I'd ever actually seen his face. I'd seen the jacket, heard the voice, but the face. It was just a blur in my mind. The clerk must have seen something in my expression because he came out with me and checked the car himself. He looked at me and said, "You okay, man? You look pale." I nodded and mumbled something about needing sleep. Drove back to the dispatch office without another fare. Didn't even bother turning the meter off. Later that morning, I checked the log to confirm the ride, but there was no record of it. Not on the company server, not on the printed shift sheet. Just a blank space between 2:14 and 2:53 a.m. Out of habit, I checked the dash cam footage too. I hadn't looked at it in months, but I remembered the system ran on a loop and kept the last 4 hours of video. There was footage of the pickup headlights sweeping the lot, the passenger door opening, but nobody entering the car. The door opened, stayed that way for 6 seconds, then closed. The audio picked up my voice asking where, followed by silence. A few more lines of me talking, pauses, then me saying, "This ride's on me." I still have the clip. I've watched it maybe a dozen times. Not because I think it'll change, but because I keep wondering how long I drove with that back seat full of silence, and whether anyone else has ever picked him up before or since. I changed cab companies a few months later, switched to the daytime shift. Less quiet, less space for things to find you. But sometimes if I pass an empty lot or a shuttered warehouse, I'll glance at the back seat without meaning to, just in case. They told us to stop using Channel 3 years ago, said it caused too much cross-frequency bleed from the heliport and ambulance dispatch. But one night, out of habit, I flipped back to it while making rounds. Static first, then a child's voice, faint but clear. "Can anyone hear me? I'm still here. Please, don't leave." My name's Mark Holloway. I was 42 when this happened, working night security at St. Joseph's in Southern Oregon. The hospital's an older place, built in phases over decades. Some wings date back to the early 70s. Long, low corridors with flickering lights and vinyl tiles that always feel slightly damp. They'd recently started renovations, which meant certain units were sealed off, stripped to studs, or temporarily reassigned. One of those was Unit 47 Delta, the old pediatric wing. It had been closed since 2016 after a sprinkler burst caused ceiling damage. No one went in there except maintenance and occasionally me. That night had started like any other. Around 2:00 a.m., I was doing my circuit along the service hallway by the west elevators. The place was dead quiet, except for the hum of HVAC and the occasional beep from the nurse's station. I carried one of the older two-way radios, heavy, scratched up, but reliable. When I switched to Channel 3, I didn't expect anything. That channel hadn't been used since before the closure. But there it was again, a soft, static-laced child's voice. "I'm in the room with the moon wallpaper. I've been good. I'm still waiting." I stopped walking. The lights overhead buzzed faintly. I looked at the radio like it might be playing some old recording, but the batteries were standard. Nothing fancy, no playback. I pressed the call button. "This is security." "Say again." "Nothing, just static." I reported it to facilities in the morning. The tech guy, Brent, just shook his head. "You probably picked up some cross-channel bleed," he said. "Maybe from a baby monitor nearby." That made sense, I guess. But the thing that sat wrong with me was the mention of the moon wallpaper. I remembered that room. Back when the pediatric wing was active, Room 8 had a full mural moons and stars. On one wall, hand-painted decades ago, the artist had signed the bottom corner. It had since been painted over when they emptied the unit. Over the next week, I kept hearing the voice. Always late, always short phrases. "Mom said you'd come. Is it morning yet? I can see your light." That last one chilled me more than anything. I had just turned the corner with my flashlight when I heard it like the voice was watching. There was no one in sight. Just sheets of plastic over empty door frames, tools left half-used by crews who didn't like working that part of the building after dark. One night I asked facilities to check the signal sources. Brent brought in a signal trace device and walked the corridor with me. When I heard the voice again, I handed him the radio. He stopped, eyebrows tightening. "That's Channel 3, he said. "It shouldn't be active." The signal traced back to a dead spot near the old laundry chute, a wall that used to connect to the pediatric nurses' station. That section had been remodeled and sealed. On paper, nothing was inside. No wiring, no open frequencies. But Brent looked pale. "You sure that was a kid?" he asked. I didn't answer. A week later, I brought in a handheld scanner I'd borrowed from another guard more sensitive than our standard gear. I left it running while I checked exterior doors. When I came back, it had recorded a partial clip. The voice said, "Tommy. My name is Tommy." That changed everything. I went digging through old incident logs and internal archives stuff from before the database moved online. I found one report dated 2009 about a missing child named Tommy Mitchell, 6 years old, admitted with respiratory issues, discharged, but never officially signed out. The chart ended abruptly, marked moved to long-term hold records incomplete. When I asked medical records for more, they told me that Floor had suffered a flood shortly after files lost. It didn't feel like an error. The final night it happened, I was patrolling the lower mechanical level near where the new parking garage connects. The radio tuned to Channel 3 squawked once. Then a voice, "I hear the wheels now. I'm down here." I was alone. The loading dock was shut. My flashlight flickered for half a second, then steadied. I followed the signal's strength, even though my gut told me not to. It drew me to a cinder block wall behind the old fuse room. I tapped along the surface and found one panel with a slightly different pitch, like there was space behind it. Brent met me there an hour later after I called him from the stairwell. Together we pulled the panel off. Behind it was a narrow cavity, maybe 3 feet deep. Inside was an old radio, one of our units with the ID number scuffed but still readable. According to inventory logs, it had been missing since 2016. Right next to it was a faded lunchbox, a toy ambulance, and a tiny fleece blanket with the hospital's old logo. Tucked inside the blanket was a laminated visitor badge. Tommy M. Facilities shut the cavity immediately. Risk of asbestos, they said. HR told me to drop the matter. No further comment. The next week, Unit 47 Delta was demolished completely to make way for an imaging suite. But the voice stopped. I still keep the scan recording on an old flash drive. I don't know why. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's the feeling I should have done more earlier. Sometimes I dream of that hallway plastic sheets shifting in the airflow, little shadows just behind the bend. And I still remember the last thing Tommy ever said right before the signal went silent. "I knew you'd find me." I used to think I liked the routine of it. The way the hum of the coolers faded into background noise. The way the parking lot lights flickered at exactly 3:11 each night, like they were catching their breath. But it's strange what your mind starts to fixate on when you work alone for too long, especially past midnight. There was one thing I could count on more than anything during that shift. A man in a faded leather jacket who pulled in at 3:17 a.m. Sharp. Every single night. I don't know his name. Never asked, never offered. He drove an old blue Toyota Camry early 2000s, maybe a little rust at the rear fender. Always parked at the second pump from the door. Never closer, never further. Just that one. He'd step out, pump exactly $12 worth of gas, and come inside with a slow, even gait. Grabbed the same things every time. 1 pack of Marlboro Lights, 1 bottle of black coffee in a glass bottle, and a banana. If the rack had one that wasn't too brown. Paid cash, exact change. Didn't talk much sometimes, just a nod or a thanks. For the first couple nights I didn't think much of it. People are creatures of habit. But after about a week, the timing started to stand out. He was never early, never late. I'd glance at the clock when the headlights hit the window, and it'd be 3:17 exactly. The precision of it got under my skin in a way I couldn't quite explain. I even tested the store clock against my phone and the register system. Everything matched. I started waiting for him without realizing it, like my body anticipated it before my brain did. Then one night, it must have been a Wednesday, because the trucker with the chipped tooth had just come through for his usual lotto tickets. The blue Camry didn't show. I watched the clock roll past 3:17, then 3:18. Nothing. At first, I figured maybe his routine had just broken. Flu, flat tire, who knows? But something about the stillness of that hour made it feel bigger. I kept glancing at the window every few seconds, as if willing the headlights to appear. They didn't. It was 3:26 when another car finally pulled in. A dark gray sedan, newer model, no rust, pulled into the exact same pump. I stood there behind the counter watching. The driver didn't get out, just sat there with the engine running. Tinted windows, I couldn't make out a face. I waited expecting movement, a window roll down, anything. Nothing happened. Eventually, I walked around the counter and opened the front door, half expecting the car to pull away. It didn't. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just breathing in the cold air and the faint scent of diesel. Then the driver's side window rolled down. I couldn't see much inside, but I swear the man behind the wheel was wearing the same brown leather jacket. Just sitting there, staring straight ahead. Not at me, not at anything. His hands were on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, like he was waiting to be told what to do next. I stepped back inside and locked the door without realizing it. By the time I looked again, the car was gone. No tail lights, no engine sound, just empty. Concrete and the flickering glow of Pump 2. The next night, the original car was back, the blue Camry. Same man, same routine. $12 of gas. The banana this time had a brown spot, but he still bought it. No comment, no questions. Just that quiet nod. I didn't say anything about the other car. I figured maybe I'd hallucinated it or dreamed it in that strange, half-awake state you slip into around 300 a.m. But the feeling didn't leave me. I started watching the cameras, just to confirm he was real. I'd rewind and watch him walk the same number of steps, grab the same items, stand the same way in line. Every movement night after night like it had been choreographed. About 2 weeks after that odd night, he didn't come in again. 3:17 came and went. And again, a different car pulled in. This time, a white van, parked at Pump 2. Same routine. Driver didn't exit. But through the windshield, I could see the outline of someone sitting very still, leather jacket again, hands at 10 and 2. That's when I decided to ask the sheriff's office if they'd had any incidents. Not a report, just a quiet question to Deputy Halloran when he came in for coffee around dawn. He chuckled at first, said I was probably just tired. But when I mentioned the timing, the amount, the jacket, the way the other cars started showing up, his face shifted a little. He said there'd been a guy years back who fit that routine. Name was Ed Talbot. Worked night shifts, lived alone, always kept things exact. He died in 2009. Car wreck on the county line, hit, a deer went off the road. It happened at 3:17 a.m. Deputy Halloran said it like it was just a detail, but I saw the way he avoided looking me in the eye. I checked the footage from the next few nights. Sometimes the blue Camry came. Sometimes it was another vehicle, but the jacket never changed. Neither did the behavior. It was like the routine was the only thing holding him together. I worked that job for another 3 months. Every night I watched Pump 2. Sometimes the driver stepped out, sometimes not. But I stopped going outside. I stopped trying to figure it out. Because one night around 3:14, I noticed something new. The receipts, the ones I'd tear off and drop into the bin after every shift, had started to pile up oddly. One of them had writing on the back. Just a few words in shaky pen. Thank you. I remember you. I don't usually talk about this. It's the kind of memory that sits quietly until some small sound unlocks it like a faucet drip at 2 in the morning or a door hinge settling in an empty building. I started at Hayes and Miller Funeral Home in the fall of 2015. The job came through a church friend after I'd left a warehouse shift and needed something steadier. The place was a brick house with a long addition behind it, half family parlor and half business. By day, the rooms smelled of lilies and furniture polish. After dark, the air turned cooler, and the lights along the walls buzzed just enough to make you think about electricity passing through thin wires. My duties were simple. Tidy the chapel, reset the chairs, check the coffee urns, and make sure the front doors were locked before I took the keys upstairs to the office. The building had 3 cameras that fed to a small monitor by the hallway desk, one on the front entrance, one in the back hallway, and one wide angle fixed on the chapel from above the center aisle. The cameras were old, but they worked, and I liked having them on when I was there alone. The Finch service wrapped around 8 that night. Pastor Ward gave a gentle eulogy, and people took their time saying goodbye. The family left in a quiet cluster near 9, carrying casserole dishes and a cardboard box of framed photos. I waited another half hour for stragglers, then did the usual routine collected programs, picked up a dropped pocket tissue, and checked the side door that opened to the gravel lot. It was a cool October evening. You could smell damp leaves when the back door opened, and the motion light over the lot hummed to life, and then faded again. By 9:45, the building settled into that heavy quiet you only notice when you're the last one there. I loaded the dishwasher in the little kitchenette, wiped the counters, and turned on the hall monitor so I could watch the chapel while I finished paperwork. That's when I heard the knocking. It wasn't loud. 3 even raps knuckles on wood. I paused, listened, and decided it was a pipe or the stair tread by the office. A minute later, the sound came again. Same rhythm, same distance in between. Not frantic, not hesitant, like someone asking politely to be let out. I walked to the monitor and watched the chapel feed. The camera's angle took in the whole room, from the double doors to the closed casket beneath the central light. Nothing moved. The sconces along the aisle cast their soft cones, and the carpeting looked darker near the front where people had stood longest. I stood there longer than made sense, waiting for something to insist on its presence. When it happened, it was almost ordinary. A figure stepped into the frame from the far left, tall and narrow, shouldered the shape of a coat moving along the center aisle. Not a blur, not a trick of light. It moved with weight, each step measured like a person who had some place to be. The figure walked straight down the aisle and continued toward the side exit that should have been locked since I checked it. The door itself did not move. No handle turned. The figure passed the line where the door should have stopped it and kept going out of frame. I realized my hands were on the desk, pressing hard enough to ache. I backed the footage up and watched it again, then again, slower. The door never opened. The figure never entered earlier. It only left. I walked to the chapel more out of procedure than bravery. The air inside was a little colder the way older buildings hold pockets of temperature like forgotten drawers. The casket was still closed, the floral stands where we had placed them, and the aisle runner straight. One thing disturbed the neatness. A chair in the third row sat angled slightly toward the aisle, as if someone had risen quickly and not set it back. I have set hundreds of chairs in straight lines. You know when one is off. I left it as it was and went to check the side door. The deadbolt was turned. I tugged the handle once and felt the satisfying refusal of locked hardware. When I stepped outside by the gravel, the motion light didn't come on. It should have, even for me. I waved my arm to be sure and got nothing. The lot was quiet, the kind of quiet that hangs in your ears when the crickets stop all at once. I went back inside and turned the bolt again as one more act of faith. On the way to the front desk, I passed the guest book. We put it on a small table with a pen in a brass holder. People write, "So sorry for your loss," or prayers for the family in careful script. I've flipped through many of those pages, more names than I could ever remember. On the last line for Mr. Finch, there was a name I didn't recognize. Just a first name slanted in black ink, Royce. There was no message, no last initial. I scanned the other lines in case I had missed it earlier. The name wasn't there twice. I called upstairs to Irene, the owner who lived in a small apartment behind the office when she worked late. She came down in her sweater and peered at the page, then at the angled chair down the aisle. She had directed services for 30 years and could tell you which family had brought which flowers by scent alone. She looked at me with the kind of calm people lean on and said we would check the cameras again in the morning. I left the chapel lights on and walked the back corridor more for my nerves than for necessity. The hallway thermostat clicked as it adjusted. Somewhere in the building, a compressor kicked in and settled. When I returned to the monitor, I rewound and watched the exit sequence another time, then clicked through to the front camera to confirm no one had entered. The front doors never opened after the last family left. I locked the office, set the alarm, and sat in the manager's chair until the time on the wall clock and the time on my wrist matched as if alignment would grant me certainty. Morning made everything seem less serious. It often does. Irene brewed coffee. We printed the log sheets and we watched the chapel video with proper daylight on the walls. The figure looked the same in the morning as at night. It moved with purpose. It passed the fixed line of the door. The side camera in the back hallway showed no corresponding motion. The only sound on this recording was the soft hum of the sconce transformer. We asked Pastor Ward if anyone named Royce had signed the register or spoken to him during the service. He said he hadn't heard that name and remembered only cousins, a neighbor from the hardware store, and 2 men from the American Legion who stood stiffly by the entry. Irene called the family. They didn't recognize the name either. I suggested it could be a middle name. People use those sometimes in older towns. No one could think of one. Before lunch, Irene closed the guest book and tucked it in the top drawer. She rested her hand on the cover in a way that made me understand she was praying without saying so. "This building is from 1954, she said. "It remembers more people than any of us do. Some never learned the new doors. Some never wanted to." She saw the look on my face and added in a tone that made it advice, "Do your work and go home. Whatever keeps walking can finish without you." I nodded and did my tasks. The chapel needed to be reset for a small afternoon visitation, so I straightened the third-row chair and walked the aisle once more to check for scuffed carpet. The misaligned chair had left a faint groove in the nap that didn't brush out. You could see where it had turned if you looked from the side, a subtle arc in the pile. I went past the side door on my way to the supply closet. The bolt was turned. I pressed the door and felt that heavy, immovable honesty. Again. For a week, I worked evenings with a purposeful lack of imagination. Sometimes pattern is a comfort you can hold in your hands. The urns boiled at the same time. The exit signs glowed at the same strength. The cameras clicked on when I asked. Every now and then, right around close, I would hear a sound from the chapel like someone smoothing a suit jacket across their knees. When I listened too long, there was nothing but the small electrical hum that all buildings share if you stand very still. On the following Friday, I stayed late to help the florist recover stands. It was past 11 when she left, and I did one last walk through the public rooms. The guest book sat where we'd put it for the new family. When I turned the pages to check how much space remained, I found a slip of paper tucked near the back. It was a torn corner from an old program. On it was the same slanted handwriting as before. Just one word: Royce. I looked at the monitor out of instinct. The chapel was empty. The aisle runner was straight. The side door's camera we had added a temporary one after my report showed only the rectangle of glass in its frame. I watched until the little time stamp marched past midnight like footsteps. Nothing moved. Nothing insisted. I locked up and walked outside to the gravel lot. The motion light came on this time, bright and ordinary. It threw my shadow long across the stones and picked up the shine of a tire track where the florist had parked. The air smelled like rain was coming in a few hours. I stood there long enough to feel foolish and then reached for the handle to go back in and double-check the alarm. Through the glass, the chapel lay quiet and square. The first row of chairs faced the casket like pews in a small church. That is what I saw first. What kept my hand on the handle was a shape where the interior hallway met the chapel's side door. Not a person, not anything you could report. Just the shadow of a coat cast across the wall at an angle that had no source. The sconce along that stretch flickered once and steadied. The shadow did not change while the light did. Irene's words came to me then, ordinary and practical. Finish what you can and go home. I turned the key and left the building with the lights set as we always set them. On the drive to my apartment, I kept checking the rear view and saw only my own face washed pale by street lamps. I stayed with the job another year and a half. The camera system was replaced that spring, which meant the old tapes were boxed for storage and never revisited. The register with the torn slip vanished when we cleaned for repainting. New families came and went. New names filled the lines. Sometimes when I passed the chapel on a quiet afternoon, I thought about the third row groove that didn't brush out, and how a chair can reveal more about a person than a loud entrance ever will. Every so often, if I'm in that part of town, I slow as I pass the brick building and glance toward the side door's narrow window. I don't expect to see anyone. The lot looks the same as any other lot, and the light hums with the same dependable patience. Still, when the evening air is just right, I catch myself listening, not for knocking and not for a whisper. I listen for the sound a person makes when he stands quietly at the end of what he came to do and then chooses to walk away. I used to make long drives through Arkansas back when my job meant chasing accounts across 3 states. The routes blurred together most weeks, but there was one stop in Pine Hollow I never forgot. It was a small place off the main highway, little more than a gas station, a sagging motel, and a diner that seemed to hold the whole town together. The diner was clean enough, though worn with years. The vinyl seats cracked at the edges, the blinds yellowed with dust, and the pie cooler always had 2 or 3 slices left from the afternoon. Dana, the waitress, remembered faces more than names. She'd slide a coffee across the counter before I ordered and ask if I wanted my eggs the same as last time. That night in November, rain hammered the lot hard enough to blur the glowing motel sign across the street. The place was empty, but for me and one other man. He sat in the corner booth under the clock, a brown jacket draped over his shoulders. His plate was empty except for a fork laid neatly at an angle. What made me notice him was how still he was watching the rain without blinking. He didn't turn when Dana refilled his cup, didn't shift when the door's bell clanged as a trucker came in and left. I figured he was just worn out from the road, like all of us who ended up there. Around 9, Dana brought me the check. She leaned closer than usual and said, "You want to take this to go on Storm's getting worse." There was something in her tone that made me look back at the booth. It was empty. The jacket remained folded now, with the fork resting on top. I hadn't seen him rise, hadn't heard the door. The bell always rang, even the faintest push made it sing against the glass. I asked Dana when the man had left. She frowned and said he hadn't. I pointed at the booth at the jacket, but she only shook her head. "That seat's been like that all night. Nobody's used it." Her voice was matter-of-fact, not spooked, not teasing. I wanted to argue to say I had watched him with my own eyes, but the words caught when she gave me the bill, and her hand brushed mine with an unspoken message: "Don't." I took the slip, tucked a few bills under the saucer, and walked to the door. The rain had slackened, though the street shimmered with standing water. As I pushed into the night, I glanced back at the window. The booth was empty, but the clock above it ticked toward 10, with the certainty of things that don't lie. I pulled my jacket tight and crossed to the motel. In my room, the heater rattled like bones in a tin, and the curtains didn't quite close. I lay there listening to the last drops strike the metal railing outside. Somewhere between the hiss of the radiator and the pulse of the rain, I thought I heard the sound of a doorbell chiming faintly far off. I got up to check, telling myself it was the wind playing tricks, but when I parted the curtains, the diner sat dark and closed across the street. I went back to bed with that image, an empty booth, a folded jacket, and the quiet certainty that someone had been sitting there watching the storm with me. I never stopped at Pine Hollow again, not because of fear exactly, more because it felt like I had interrupted something I wasn't supposed to see, and leaving it behind was the only way to keep the world ordinary. That was the last memory I'll share tonight, and it lingers with me more than I'd like. What ties all of these stories together isn't blood or violence, but the quiet weight of ordinary places holding something we're not meant to name. Highways, diners, motels, towns tucked against rivers. They were built for rest, for passing through. Yet sometimes they keep things instead. They keep echoes of footsteps, names written in books, figures who rise from chairs and walk where no door opens. When I think back on the stories I've carried, I realize the unease comes not from what shouted, but from what stayed silent. The angled chair, the missing name, the figure in the corner booth, they never demanded attention. Yet they stayed with me all the same. Maybe that's the truest kind of fear, the kind that sits in the back of your memory, until years later you still recall the exact hum of a light or the smell of rain on gravel. If you've stayed with me through all these accounts, I hope they leave you not unsettled beyond rest, but quietly aware. There are corners of the world where time folds strangely, where we glimpse something or someone we were not meant to, and the best we can do is carry the memory without trying to solve it. After all, not every shadow asks to be explained, and not every echo belongs to the past. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. It means more than I can say. If you'd like to hear more stories told this way, please consider subscribing, sharing, or following so you can join me again. And I'd like to know, have you ever passed through a place that seemed ordinary, yet something about it never left you? Tell me in the comments when you're ready. For now, rest easy and good night.